This is Garis book readings of my 2 published paper books written by and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo Garis. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. This is chapter 7, part 2? 3? Forgetting. Of my second book entitled Multis and Monos, What the Multicultured Can Teach the Monocultured Towards the Creation of a Global State. This is just continuing straight on. This is section F on the Chapter 7, topic is Forces Opposing Globa. Section F, entitled The Clash of Ideologies. In 1962, the planet almost had a nuclear war between the USSR and the USA over the Cuban Missile Crisis. The US at the time had intercontinental ballistic nuclear missiles in Turkey within range of Moscow, so Khrushchev put Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba within range of the US. President Kennedy set up a naval blockade to stop the delivery of more Soviet missiles to Cuba, and the world held its breath, terrified to see what Khrushchev would do. I was 15 at the time, and remember the fear in my teacher's eyes as one of them said to another, "Is this the last day?" Khrushchev removed the Cuban missiles on the agreement by Kennedy that the US would not invade Cuba and that the US would remove their missiles from Turkey. What was that all about? Why did the two sides risk total nuclear annihilation? What did they disagree about? The answer was deep-seated ideological differences over who should own capital. I truly admire some philosophers/ideologists. They rule men's minds by putting ideas into their heads that then govern their actions to a large extent. Look at the impact on billions of people's lives of the ideas of Locke and Rousseau, with their views that leaders should be chosen by the people and be thrown out of office when they do a bad job. These democratic ideas have spread across the planet. 2/3 of the nations of the planet are now democracies, that is, about 120 plus of them, or nowadays it's about 130. At the rate countries are democratizing, there will be no dictatorships left in about 40 years, well now 30 years. Look at the power of Marx's ideas that sparked communistic revolutions in many countries. Not so long ago, about half the population of the earth was living under communist regimes. Marx's critique of early capitalism was so devastating that many people were inspired by his fiery words to take up arms and rebel against what Marx described as economic exploitation. Marx's main ideas have already been briefly described in the previous chapter, but are given here in greater detail since we're now talking about ideological differences. Since the capitalist-communist difference was the biggest ideological difference of the 20th century, we need to understand fairly well the essence of Marxism that communism was based on. The essence of Marx's ideas can be explained fairly simply. He began his analysis of early capitalism with his labor theory of value, that is, the value of exchange of a good, that is it worth 2 hens or 3 hens in exchange? It depends on how much labor went into producing it. When the Industrial Revolution began, the steam engine mechanized labor and made it more productive than the traditional cottage industries. Thus the factory system could produce goods more cheaply and put the cottage industries out of business. Thus the former cottage workers lost their markets and their jobs and were forced to work in the factories to stay alive. Since steam engines and other industrial equipment is expensive, only the rich could afford them. The only thing that the ordinary workers of the masses could sell was their own labor power. This made them readily exploitable. Marx spoke of the concept of surplus value, meaning that, using his labor theory of value, that the workers produced a lot more value in the goods that they made than the value of the wages they received from their employers, who owned the machines, the factories, etc., that is, the capital. Marx labelled such owners capitalists, One sees here the ideologist in action, using new concepts that stirred people's minds and gave them new labels so that people could manipulate them in their minds and talk about them. Thus Marx was saying that the nature of capitalism is inherently one of theft. The capitalists were robbing the labour value of the employees, the workers. They got rich while the workers were paid subsistent wages to stay alive. He felt such a system was terribly unjust and should be overthrown. Workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. Marx wanted to see a society created in which the means of production, the machines, the factories, the farms, etc., would be owned by everyone, that is, community-owned, a system of communalism, or communism for short. Marx was thus a passionate communist. Many people heard this call and created whole governments based on his vision. I'm currently living in one at the present time, that is, China, which officially is still Marxist, with its figurehead being Mao Zedong, the founder of the country, who was a Marxist. The capitalists hated the communists because the communists threatened to take away their exploited wealth and force them to work for their income, the way the workers did. In America, for example, in an era when at least most people could read, the capitalists took control of the media and so brainwashed the workers that communists were evil that America never really had a workers' political party, equivalent to, for example, the Labour Party of the UK, or many social or socialist democratic parties of continental Europe. When Mao came to power in the 1940s, he had millions of exploiting landlords executed and their land distributed to the people who worked it. Prior to Mao, the landlords lived off the backs, that is the labour, of the peasants and grew rich. Marx touched a raw nerve in millions of people's minds, so that millions of people became communists. However, the spread of communism was matched by a comparable spread of capitalism across the planet due to the greater productivity levels of the machines. In Europe, the answer to the excessive exploitation of the workers was to create democratic socialism, that is, give the workers the vote, create labour political parties, bring in progressive taxation, that is, the richer people pay a higher proportion of their income in tax than the poorer people. Allow the creation of labour unions, that is, organisation of workers who can go and strike to force employers to pay higher wages. The legislation of a minimum wage, a national health insurance scheme that the Americans still don't have, one of the last countries in the world not to have one. This was in 2007. Most modern rich countries have copied the European model and have benefited from the wealth-making drives of the capitalist entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs, or capitalists as Marx called them, hunger for profits and wealth, so are motivated to face the risks of bankruptcy and loss of personal fortune by investing their money into bringing new products and services to the marketplace. Competition between capitalists for sales forces productivity increases in order to lower the prices of goods so that consumers will buy them. Thus the whole society benefits from a greater quantity of cheaper goods. This is Adam Smith's notion of the invisible hand. However, other cultures with more autocratic traditions, such as Russia and China, chose a form of communism based on the dictatorship of an elite. Russia was the first, under Lenin, who argued that the rise of communism should be spearheaded by a single disciplined communist political party dedicated to seizing power and then creating a communalistic or communist system. A generation later, the Chinese did the same after fighting a bitter civil war with a capitalist-based dictatorial regime under Chiang Kai-shek. Unfortunately, the prediction made in the mid-1800s by Marx's powerful intellectual and ideological arch-rival, the anarchist Bakunin, that a communistic dictatorship is still a dictatorship and would corrupt the leadership, turned out to be true. Both Stalin and Mao turned out to be utter tyrants, two of the three greatest mass-murdering criminals, along with Hitler, of the 20th century, both killing tens of millions of people, with probably Mao killing the most, because his country had a larger population. It's reckoned Mao killed about 80 million people. 45 million, the Great Famine that he caused for 58 to 62. He put about 50 million people through the Lao Gai, that's the slave labor camps, concentration camps for political prisoners. There are 3 to 5 million people in these Laogai today in today's China, according to Harry Wu, the founder of the Laogai Museum. Look it up on YouTube, laogaimuseum.org, I think. So for most of the 20th century, the world was divided into two major ideological blocks, the capitalist and the communist, with each hating the other, and armed against each other with the most modern and most destructive of weapons, that is, the hydrogen bombs that could kill not just whole cities, but whole counties. The capitalist hated the communists because it saw the example of the USSR and China, which were both dictatorships. The communists hated the capitalists because they saw the capitalist regimes as being based on theft of the labour of workers, as immoral. The threat of mutually assured destruction, MAD, with nuclear weapons during the Cold War meant that no war between the two superpowers of the US and the USSR took place, thank God. But it was clear that the two sides detested each other on ideological grounds. These two societies were profoundly divided due to their ideological differences, as is still the case with the US and China at the time of writing. Russia made a partial change to democracy, whereas China is still a dictatorship, although slowly losing its grip on its people as greater wealth, education, the internet, travel, etc. causes the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, to lose its legitimacy with the Chinese public. Nevertheless, for nearly a century, the clash of ideologies between the East and West was so severe that they almost annihilated each other during the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Ideological differences can bitterly divide peoples, so how can the globalists possibly hope to bring peoples together into a global state? I suggest the short answer to that question is by using superior technologies. One of the historical correlates with ideology has been geography, that is, that ideological and religious beliefs tend to be geographically located. For example, the capitalists were mostly in the Western countries, the communists in the Eastern countries. Until the rise of global telecommunications in the modern age, large distances between political power centres meant that they evolved rather independently of each other, and hence were not influenced much by each other. One can talk about the tyranny of distance in this sense. With local, that is, national communications, it was possible for dictatorial leaders such as Hitler to indoctrinate his people with his party's viewpoint, and only his party's viewpoint. Even in non-dictatorial regimes, the same kind of phenomenon occurs. For example, monocultured media influence monocultures to have nationalistic views, that is, to hold the views of the nations they live in. This is because the creators of the media, that is, the journalists, are often as monocultured as the monocultured populations they feed their stories to. Hence, in a sense, it's a case of the blind leading the blind, or monos leading the monos. To reduce geographically based ideological differences, it's essential that the media be at least multicultural and preferably global. The planet is reaching this level of technological advancement only now, at the time of writing. It's only now that it becomes technologically possible to present people with views from all over the world, and importantly, that people get to hear rival views, not just the views of one group, and especially not only from one group in power, and even more especially, not only from one group in dictatorial power. I remember in the 1980s being very impressed being able to watch multicultural television in Brussels and zap from a French TV channel to a German TV channel in my living room, listening in both the French and German languages to a Franco-German political dispute, getting the two perspectives. At the time, the French and the Germans had mostly monocultured media, so were unable to be influenced by each other, in contrast to the case today, in which European countries tend to have multicultured media from most of their neighbouring European countries. In other words, Europeans can zap cultures. That is, they can watch TV from many other European countries in their own living rooms. Now, simply supplying a media with programs coming from many dozens of countries from around the world is not going to have much impact on most people, because most people are linguistically lazy. That is, they will simply not bother learning other languages. Personally, I can sympathise with this because I've taught myself French, Dutch and German, with a bit of Japanese, and know all too well how much effort is involved in absorbing into one's brain the many thousands of words and tens of thousands of expressions that are needed to become fluent in a foreign language. The intellectuals, however, will bother to make the effort. For example, in the 1980s, when I was living in Brussels, the intelligent, educated people were often quadrilingual at the time, that is, fluent in French, Dutch, English and German. I can imagine the intellectuals living in New York City would love to have quality French television that they could watch and become Frenchified to some extent. But they don't, at least not yet. They do have radio though. They can listen to France Culture on the internet and get French intellectual level radio discussions aimed explicitly at France's intellectuals, sages. But they would have to pay the price of learning fluent French, and even harder, fluent intellectual French with a rich intellectual vocabulary. Even for intellectuals, the linguistic barrier remains formidable, so for a global media to be effective and to provide solutions to so many of the world's problems that are caused indirectly by differences in monocultured ideological viewpoints, there will need to be a global language. Then and only then will true multicultural exchanges of views become possible. This development is yet to occur. It's still underway. There are hundreds of millions of young people around the world now learning English. This is a good sign for the creation of a global media. It's a precondition. Once the planet has global media in a global language, then ideological differences can be diffused and reduced. The differences remaining will then be individual, depending on individual personalities and personal histories, rather than due to the influences of monocultured media on populations in geographically isolated and separated regions of the planet. With a global media and a global language, the ideological differences remaining between individuals will be far less potent in causing wars and ideological conflict than the older geographically correlated ideological differences. If X% of people in culture C1 have a certain view V, and if a second culture C2 shares its media with C1 in the world language, then it's quite likely that roughly the same percentage, that is X% of people in C2, will also have the same view V. Hence, if one belongs to C1, it will not be possible to direct one's anger at C2s having X% of people who have view V, because roughly the same percentage of people in C1 also have that view V. So ideological disputes will become more interpersonal and less intercultural, thus making them less potent in causing wars between the two cultures. G. Religious differences. In the 30 Years' War in Germany, actually in the various German princedoms of the time in the 17th century, initially over differences in religious ideas between the Catholics and the Protestants, Protestant being a French word meaning protesting, about a third of the population died. It was one of the most bitter and deadly confrontations in history. There are not many historical examples in which a third of a population is killed off. From the point of view of a modern atheist, a non-theist, that is someone who does not believe in a loving creator, this dispute is difficult to understand. Similarly with the European witch craze of about the same time, in which large numbers of women were burned alive at the stake for supposedly being devil worshippers, that is, worshippers of a different god. Religion is a very powerful force. It's one of the few cultural anthropological universals, that is, it's a phenomenon that is culturally universal. Every primitive tribe invents its own gods. For example, the European god has a Caucasian face. The Chinese gods have Chinese faces. New Guinea gods have lots of pigs, etc. Why the need to invent gods? What function does having a god serve human beings? It's so universal that the suspicion arises that religious beliefs may be genetically programmed into us, that is, our brains may be wired up to be religious, to invent gods. There are Darwinian thinkers who claim that belief in a loving God, or at least gods, who can be called upon to protect helpless human beings from the ravages of famine, war, disease, premature death, etc., has survival value. People who have such beliefs, the argument goes, would be less likely to suicide or give up in the face of a meaningless, cold, brutal world. Such a belief would increase the individual's survivability, that is, his/her Darwinian fitness. Religious beliefs can be very strong. When the early Christians were given a choice between being thrown to the lions in the Roman Colosseum or giving up their new beliefs, many chose to die. Why? Why do people hold to their religious beliefs so strongly, and why do they feel so threatened by people who live near them who hold different beliefs? If the planet is to live in a global, culturally homogeneous state, then religious differences will need to fade away. But if people hold on to their religious beliefs so strongly, how can such homogeneity arise? Let me attempt to answer this difficult question with a personal example. In my previous country, the US, I was living in a small university town which was 3/4 Mormon. The Mormon beliefs were so ridiculous in my mind that they profoundly alienated me from that community. For me to be able to accept their beliefs, I would have had to totally undermine my own set of deep beliefs about the world. That is, in my case, my scientific worldview, my strongly held attitudes about the way the world is and how one obtains knowledge. I'm a scientist. I demand proof of assertions. I'm extremely cynical of religions. I see them as superstitions. I see them as psychological crutches for gullible, ignorant minds who lack the knowledge or the intelligence to question what they've been told as children. Once one has travelled a bit, one quickly learns that there are many gods, that what is believed in terms of religion is a matter of time and space. That is, what people believe depends to a large extent on when and where they are living. For example, if you are living in the Arab world, you are probably a Muslim. If you live in the US, you are probably a Christian, or a Christist, as I like to label a Christian. If you lived in Tibet, you are probably a Buddhist, etc. Also, over time, religions have changed, because religions had to be invented. There was no Christianity 3,000 years ago, because the guy who invented this religion, that is the sect leader, was Jesus Christ, who invented it 2,000 years ago. In my Mormon small town, the sect leader of Mormonism, Joseph Smith, lived in the early 1800s, so Mormonism, America's homegrown religion, is less than 200 years old. If one reads books on the history of religions, one learns that humanity has invented about 100,000 different gods over the broad sweep of history across the whole planet, and that most of them are now dead gods. This death of gods phenomenon is not surprising. It's analogous with the idea of the extinction of species in biology. Today, some 99.9% of all species that have ever lived on the Earth are now extinct. Hence it becomes clear that religions are invented by human beings. What is also clear from a history of religious development point of view is that the level of sophistication of the religious ideas invented by tribes, by cities, etc., has increased over time. For example, a small hunter-gatherer community would very probably not have an intellectual genius amongst its members. The statistical odds of that happening would be too small. Hence, the level of abstraction of the religious ideas the community would be capable of inventing would be rather primitive, simple, very middle-brow. So it's not surprising that the early small-scale religions were easy to understand. For example, that objects, animals important to the survival of the community were given special spirits or godlike qualities. There were gods of the forest, the wind, the sun, the moon, the soil, the buffalo, the pig, etc. Tribes would often have many gods that members of the community could call on for assistance when times were difficult, particularly when food was scarce, children got sick and died, neighbouring tribes invaded one's hunting grounds, etc. With the rise of the agricultural revolution, that is when humanity discovered about 10,000 years ago that one could grow crops and breed animals, it became possible to feed much larger numbers of people for a given area of land. This led to the growth of the city-state with hundreds of thousands of people. Farmers could grow more food than they needed for their immediate families, so it became possible for people to become other than subsistence-level farmers. People could specialize into different professions. Some became soldiers, others priests, others tradesmen, etc. With much larger communities, the odds of having several genii in the community increased. They would become the leaders, the thinkers and priests of the community. Not surprisingly, the level of abstraction of the ideas concerning the gods they invented increased. For example, instead of there being many gods, there was a single god, and more powerful, a god who controlled everything. Over time, the properties or characteristics given to these gods changed. The priest class, that is, the intellectual elite, could invent gods to support the ruler class. The rulers could then exploit the worker class, enslave them, and have a much higher standard of living than would be possible through their own labours. For anyone who is an anthropologist of religions, it's clear how inventive humanity has been with the creation of its many gods. The creation of these gods often performed a useful function. Not only were they a source of emotional comfort to be called on in stressful times, that is, at the individual level, but they were a means to bind a community together with a common set of beliefs. Human beings are deeply social creatures and go crazy if left alone too long. It's not surprising that one of the worst punishments given to prisoners is to put them into solitary confinement. When I was living in the US with no wife, I felt the need to join some kind of social group. I was most frustrated to discover in the city where I was living that effectively the only groups that existed amongst the thinking class were religious groups. This anti-intellectualism deeply alienated me from America, and was one of the several reasons I chose to leave that country. So religion can play the role of social glue for a community. It can serve as the set of common ideas that groups of people use to define themselves as a unit. If you take away these common beliefs, the community can die, because the group members are then left unsupported by the group, because the group has disintegrated. For example, look at the way indigenous peoples such as the Native Americans or the Aborigines of Australia have become so alienated, have turned to alcohol, as their traditional beliefs have been undermined by the rise of the dominant white culture and its ideas and values. As mentioned in Chapter 4, I remember in my first months in the US, having been fairly recently widowed, getting to know a Mormon woman before I knew much about what Mormons believed in, and having the thought, if she stopped believing the nonsense she believes, she would pay a very high social price for her new non-beliefs. She would be rejected by her own family, her friends, and her community. She would become an outcast. That's how I felt in the US, a much more religious country than Europe, which is a lot more atheistic, that is, atheistic, or non-theistic than religion-mad America. So people often need religion as a form of social glue, as an organizational ideological crutch to justify or rationalize why the community exists, so as to fulfill deeply held needs for communal contact, for the feeling of belonging to a community. These needs are strong, and people will resist strongly any influence that threatens to remove this social glue. The most obvious such threat is the presence of another community nearby that has a different set of beliefs, a different religion, etc. The very presence of another community with very different ideas can be very threatening to people of the first community, because the ideological social glue used to bond it is immediately called into question by the different ideological social glue of the second community. Doubts then arise in the minds of the first community that maybe their own communal beliefs might be wrong. Since they see that the two sets of ideas, beliefs and values differ and are mutually contradictory in many respects, then at most only one of them can be correct. Could it be possible that the very different beliefs of the other community are better than one's own? If a community starts to doubt seriously its own beliefs, its own social glue, due to exposure to another community that may be a lot more sophisticated, then that community risks collapsing, or at least being seriously undermined. This can be very disturbing to the members of that community. Religions are useful not only as rationalizations for the creation and bonding of a community, but serve a deeper purpose of providing a cognitive structure for individuals to interpret the world. For example, I had an American girlfriend for a while who prayed to her personalized God, one of her own creation, more or less. I used to joke, that is, ridicule her about it. Have you considered the possibility that you might be deluding yourself, that you are talking to your own creation? I would say to her. Such rational, science-based arguments did not penetrate her. She was also a vitalist, that is, someone who thinks that there's more to a living creature than just a particular set of biochemical interactions, that is, that there exists some kind of living spirit above and beyond the material world of atoms and molecules. My statements to her that she was ignorant of the basic principles of molecular biology that explain the phenomenon of living cells and living creatures did not penetrate her either. Needless to say, that relationship did not survive. So religious beliefs can act as a kind of psychological filter or sunglasses that people use to interpret the way the world is as they see it. To someone like me, who has had a 60-year-old lifetime, well, I'm now 70, so remember this was written 10 years from the time that I'm reading this, now being 2017, lifetime of scientific learning, who expects beliefs to make sense from a scientific and logical point of view, then the beliefs of the various organized religions are simply superstitions. They are in conflict with modern scientific knowledge. For example, the Christian Old Testament belief that the world was made in 6 days